I now give the floor to Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, many thanks for giving me the opportunity to address the Council today from Kabul as officer in charge of UNAMA. As you have noted in your opening, yesterday a deadly earthquake struck Afghanistan in the early hours of the morning as the people were sleeping. So far, as of the latest information we have received, at very least nearly 800 people have been killed and more than 1,400 injured, many of them seriously, with several thousand homes destroyed and damaged. Search and rescue operations remain ongoing, and it is expected that the number of casualties will further increase over the coming days, along with the number of the affected communities. In the aftermath of the tremor, humanitarian actors mobilized an immediate response alongside counterparts from the de facto authorities, where the Ministry of Defense is in the lead, dispatching ambulances, medical equipment, trauma kits, medicine, mobile health teams, and emergency supplies, including tents, blankets, plastic sheeting, and food assistance. Interagency assessment teams were deployed immediately on the grounds within hours and remain in place, helping to coordinate and inform the humanitarian response. In the next 48 hours, I will be visiting the affected areas, meeting with the families, first-hand responders, including women's civil society groups, who are working to ensure that assistance reaches women and girls and to support overall relief efforts. I will be there with the heads of the UN agencies, delivering aid directly to the communities and the people of Afghanistan, together working on the grounds with relief agencies from civil society and international community. Their efforts are impressive and commendable. I appreciate their heroic works in the last 2 days. I'm sure you will agree that yesterday's earthquake was yet another tragic reminder of myriad dangers which are facing Afghanistan people at this time. My heartfelt condolences go out to the people of Afghanistan, to families and loved ones of those who have lost their lives, and we wish those injured a speedy recovery. Mr. President, my briefing today, however, will focus on other emergencies confronting the population in Afghanistan today, of which Wednesday's earthquake is just one. To do so, with your permission, I will focus on 4 points. These points are the human rights situation, the economic crisis, the ongoing humanitarian emergency, and finally, the need for continued engagement with the de facto authorities. Let me begin with the human rights. The human rights situation in Afghanistan remains precarious. Despite the adoption of the general amnesty and repeated assurances by the de facto authorities that it is being respected, UNAMA continues to receive credible allegations of killings, ill treatment, and other violations targeting individuals associated with the former government of Afghanistan. UNAMA also continues to receive credible allegations of violations committed by the de facto authorities against individuals accused of affiliation with the armed opposition and ISIL-KP. More needs to be done by the de facto authorities to prevent such violations and to demonstrate that then they are perpetrated, violators are held accountable. The de facto authorities have increasingly restricted the exercise of basic human rights, such as freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of opinion and expression, quelling dissent, and restricting civic space in the country. These restrictions continue to be aimed particularly at the rights and freedoms of Afghan women and girls, limiting their involvement in social, political, and economic life. These include, most prominently, the ban on secondary schooling for girls and the decision to impose face covering on women, on which you have been briefed in detail by former Special Representative Secretary General Ms. Deborah Lyons. The cost to the economy of these policies is immense. The psychological cost of being denied education, for example, are incalculable, and women are collectively being written out of the society in the way that is unique in this world. Nevertheless, let me assure this Council that UNAMA will remain a vocal and visible voice for safeguarding the human rights of people of Afghanistan, specifically those of women and girls. Mr. President, the second issue I want to address is the ongoing economic crisis. This is perhaps the single most important issue in Afghanistan as a potential driver of conflict, a driver of misery. The Afghan economy has contracted an estimated 30–40% since August. Output and incomes have reduced by 20–30%, while there has been a 50% decline in the number of households receiving remittances. It is possible that unemployment could reach 40% this year, up from 13% in 2021, and some projections indicate that poverty rates may climb as high as 97% by the end of 2022. Even more alarming, 82% of the households are now in debt, while the deteriorating economy offers few chances to climb out of that debt, and the coping resources which have helped many families to get through the winter's difficulties and the humanitarian emergency which we experienced, unfortunately those resources have been depleted. If the economy is not able to recover and grow meaningfully and sustainably, then the Afghan people will face repeated humanitarian crises, potentially spurring mass migration and making conditions ripe for radicalization and renewed armed conflict. At the same time, Afghanistan remains highly vulnerable to future climate change and geopolitical shocks. This comes on top of extreme poverty and backwardness of Afghanistan rural areas, where productivity is low and education and health services are often non-existent. Let me be very clear. These problems are at the root of all socio-economic and political dilemmas Afghanistan has faced in the past and is facing now. These need to be addressed if different social and economic outcomes are to be achieved in Afghanistan at any given time. Currently, Afghanistan is experiencing its second drought in successive years, while other emerging threats, such as floods and disease outbreak, as well as locusts and livestock diseases impacting agrarian communities and households, not to mention natural disasters such as recent earthquake, are deepening and aggravating pre-existing vulnerabilities. No matter what we do, Afghan rural areas must be given priority attention with the focus on agricultural and food systems to prevent cycles of hunger. We must help drive a grassroots economic recovery which is anchored in the creation of value chains and developing linkages between farmers and food producers and local markets. This in its turn will reduce child labor, improve health outcomes, and create an enabling environment for social development and change. It will also pave the way for substitution agriculture to replace the poppy cultivation, allowing us to capitalize on the de facto authorities' recent ban on poppy and narcotic cultivation. While doing so, we need to continue to provide adequate attention to clearance of widely unexploded ordnance of war. This bottom-up approach to economic recovery is shared by the de facto authorities and would help the most vulnerable. Already, the UN country team is implementing such approaches in rural areas through an area-based approach that channels technical and financial support directly to local communities and small enterprises, restores local small infrastructure, and provides basic income support to some of the most vulnerable in the society. However, Funding for these types of economic recovery activities is minimal so far. We need your support. Mr. President, when I and other members of the UN Senior Leadership Team travel around the country and meet with vulnerable, affected communities, the conversations leave a lasting impression. Let me share some. Afghan families are humbled and grateful for the lifeline provided by the humanitarian response. However, during this latest episode of what has been a 40-year-long crisis, they all have three straightforward, simple, and sincere requests. They want jobs to generate more income, just so that they can afford to survive on their own. They want a longer-term response to economic crisis, one that provides them a dignified means of survival and an opportunity to take a look into the future. They want safety, not only for themselves, but also for those they love. And that safety means freedom of movement for all. That includes, equally, men and women. Achieving this, even in the current operational environment, should be within our reach. With the generous support of donors, the humanitarian community has coordinated a response of unprecedented proportions to Afghanistan's massive humanitarian crisis. Between January and the end of April 2022, humanitarian partners reached 20 million people with at least one form of assistance. 19.3 million vulnerable people with humanitarian needs were helped. Nearly 250,000 cross-border returnees were assisted, 75,000 refugees, and 95,000 people affected by floods and other weather-related events. More than 19 million people were provided with food, more than 5 million with health care, 3 million children under age 5, and pregnant and lactating women were treated for acute malnutrition. 3.3 million received access to clean water, sanitation, and hygiene. 374,000 children with education support. 1.2 million people with shelter and household items. More than 2 million people with protection services. All thanks to international community's generous assistance. Despite these achievements, the humanitarian crisis persists and will require sustained support over the course of 2022 and 2023. You will receive a more detailed briefing on humanitarian needs from Mr. Martin Griffiths later this morning, UN Emergency and Relief Coordinator. Fourth, Mr. President, despite all the difficulties I have described sincerely, we firmly continue to believe that a strategy of continued engagement and dialogue remains to be the only way forward for the sake of the people of Afghanistan, as well as for the sake of regional and international security. Let me welcome here the appointment by the UN Secretary General of Ambassador Markus Potzel of Germany as the new Deputy Special Representative of Secretary General for Political Affairs, who will be responsible for leading the political engagement strategy. A few elements here important to note. The Taliban continues to hold power almost exclusively. The emergence and persistence of an armed opposition is in large part due to political exclusion. The overall security environment is becoming increasingly unpredictable. We're seeing clashes between forces of the de facto authorities and armed political opposition, specifically in Panjshir and in Bahlan provinces, as well as improvised explosive devices, attacks, and targeted assassinations against the de facto authority targets by both armed political opposition and ISIL-KP. Armed opposition attacks against the de facto authorities doubled in May comparing to April. The number of ISIL-KP attacks has generally decreased compared to the same period, but their geographic scope had widened to 11 provinces as compared to 6 previously. They cannot exclude the possibility of increased instability if people's rights are denied and if they don't see themselves included in the government. Our strategy in the months ahead seeks to promote political consultation and inclusion in a longer term. In the meantime, we're engaging with the de facto authorities to increase predictability in our relationships. Even as the international community and the Taliban remain far apart on question of human, women's and political rights, there are some areas where we can do better to improve the lives of Afghans, as well as to advance on issues of common concerns, such as counter-narcotics and mine action. Establishing an agenda of common interest will help build confidence and reduce misunderstandings. This includes type of assistance that directly support basic human needs, while moving where possible beyond pure humanitarian delivery into sustaining livelihoods of ordinary Afghans, according to basic human needs, as was described earlier in my intervention. Mr. President, the challenges ahead are significant and will require more patience. But we must endure. It is the least that Afghan people deserve. They continue to believe it is the only way forward for their benefit and the benefit of the international community. Mr. President, I thank you for your attention.
I thank Mr. Alakbarov for this